Hey internet, it's Phil and welcome back to What a Wonder. First things first, since last episode the Wonder Woman movie came out and I think we can go ahead and call it a rousing success. I think all of us Wonder Woman fans deserve a single unified I told you so to everyone who didn't believe in her. Anyway, before we go any further talking about Wonder Woman's origins, we need to talk about bondage, which is not something I ever expected to say in a video. One of the most common talking points whenever Marston's Wonder Woman run is brought up is the extent to which people get tied up. And it's true, there is a lot of tying up, especially Wonder Woman herself, but the conversation always inevitably ends up being about sex, which is fine and an interesting conversation to have, and it is certainly pertinent, especially when it comes to the Amazons, who have a lot of games about tying each other up in a 1940s comic which obviously could not depict actual sex. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to that, but I would argue that although fun, it is the least interesting part of what's going on here conceptually, and doesn't give Marston nearly enough credit. Now, I'm definitely not one to feel that Wonder Woman can't be sexy. I think her sexuality has long been denied, and some modern writers like Simone and Morrison have found ways to integrate it in a way that feels organic and natural and, importantly, not exploitative. However, the sexuality angle to all the tying up has been endlessly discussed already, and I want to bring some other points up that tend to get ignored. The first and most obvious thing to note is that while Wonder Woman does get tied up a lot, usually allowing it to happen in order to find the enemy hideout, at the end of the story she always breaks her bonds. This might seem like a throwaway or a given, but it's actually an important detail that's missed in all the talk of BDSM. Marston was in college during the women's suffrage movement, and he was a huge supporter of it. One of the hallmarks of the art and imagery of suffrage was women who were tied or chained up, expected to be nothing more than doting housewives and given few rights of their own. The breaking of these bonds symbolized women freeing themselves from the constraints that society had put on them. Wonder Woman does get chained up a lot, but she always breaks out. I think it's entirely intentional and thematically relevant, and it's a huge part of Marston's message that I think might be less obvious to a modern audience who didn't grow up with the suffrage movement. To be fair, all the ropes and chains did cause a stir during Marston's run, but he insisted that the breaking of bonds was an essential thematic element of the story he was telling and not anything sexual. Though in modern times I think most people assume there's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. This is also reinforced by Wonder Woman's one weakness. If a man chains together her bracelets the way Hercules did to the Amazons to make them slaves, she loses her super strength. The second thing that I want to talk about is another important idea that I think gets ignored when it comes to bondage in Wonder Woman, and that's the idea of loving submission. This phrase comes up a lot, with both heroes and villains willingly giving themselves over to others, often accompanied with the kind of imagery that invokes the bondage stuff that usually gets the spotlight. But let's again go beyond the kink and look at what's going on thematically. Remember, Marston's work was a rejection of patriarchal ideas of domination, conquest, and control. He wanted to encourage more feminine associated qualities of love, softness, and openness, and this is one of the ways that he did it. The comic makes a huge distinction between being tied up or controlled against your will and allowing yourself to be subservient to someone else out of love or respect. Marston is suggesting that the dynamics of power don't have to be what they are in so many other stories. You can be strong without domineering other people. You can be in control without controlling others. You can give up control without being weak. You can solve problems in other ways than by brute force. You can absolutely argue that Marston takes the idea of submission a little too far sometimes, and certainly his own views on how it relates to gender is kind of outdated, but there's still a lot in here that I think is progressive for the time and relevant today. But I think it's important to keep these ideas in mind as we go forward. The reason that I'm mentioning them now is that it will give you some context for who the supporting cast and villains are and how they operate. I really want to drive the themes that Marston is working with home so we have a good base with which to view his work and understand what he was trying to say. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the supporting cast. The Amazon society is one of the elements of Wonder Woman that I think has become the most homogenized over the years. The Amazons are often portrayed now as an antiquated society that basically preserves Greek culture as it was when they left man's world. While this is true in the original stories to an extent, I think modern Amazon depictions are much less progressive and much more warlike, much like Wonder Woman herself. Marston's Amazons still had that ancient Greek flair and they were definitely warriors, but their society was based more on advancing art, culture, and science instead of fighting, and their advances in these areas were an indictment on the conflicts of the real world at the time. The science aspect is one that gets left out a lot, though it varies from run to run. Marston's Amazons have super science. They have invisible planes with autopilot, healing rays, and other modern amenities. They even have psychic televisions that can broadcast your image and thoughts. I understand why this stuff is often put aside now, as it can be kind of wacky. What's important about this is that while it's comic booky fun, it relates directly to the worldview that Marston is trying to espouse. The Amazons have a society that functions on fundamentally different principles than the rest of the world. He's saying that we could accomplish so much more if we abandoned the pettiness and violence of war. Paradise Island is run by ideals of love, understanding, and beauty rather than power, ego, and lies, and this, he believes, creates a more productive and effective society. I think this also gets lost when people just focus on the Amazons being warriors. I tend to think of them more like Shaolin monks. The art of fighting doesn't necessarily have to actually be about war. They might come off as a little bit too perfect, but I think that throughout the series Marston makes great use of them. They have a lot to teach the outside world, but they're not in fact perfect. Hippolyta knows how bad the outside world has gotten thanks to a magic sphere, but she chooses to stay away and never intervene even when she could help. The Amazons' immortality and peace comes at the direct cost of ignoring the hardships of the rest of the world. Hippolyta sends one Amazon to man's world and only at the command of Aphrodite. This isn't mined to any great extent by Marston, but I think there's a lot to this idea that you could write around, and certainly later writers have explored this. The wonderful things the Amazons achieve are only possible because of leaving the rest of the world behind, but at some point I think you can easily argue it becomes irresponsible to ignore all the problems in the world that you have the ability to help. Wonder Woman, in her first story, uses Amazon technology to develop a healing ray that basically brings Steve Trevor back from the dead. That seems like a really nice thing for the world at large to have. I think the way that the Amazons relate or don't relate to the rest of the world is really interesting, and some later Wonder Woman runs have actually cast Diana as an ambassador for Themyscira, trying to bring peace to the world rather than fighting a war, and this is one of my absolute favorite ways to use the character in a modern setting. I think the importance of the Amazons to Diana's character is also worthy of note. Just like Batman's tragic childhood and Superman's humble childhood, the way that Diana grew up is integral to her character. She grew up in an environment of endless love, acceptance, and peace. This is what makes her journey into man's world so compelling to me. She's coming from a place that is small, isolated, and morally very simple to a world that is endlessly complex and tumultuous. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there to use when developing Wonder Woman stories, and so when the Amazons are made savage and warlike, I feel like it strips Diana of one of the most unique parts of her character and supporting cast. Also, just a quick side note, Marston's Amazons developed great strength without adding muscle mass, so they intentionally had a more pin-up-like physique. For the time, I think this was kind of a cool idea, but for modern Amazons and Wonder Woman herself, I like when they're totally ripped. Just a personal preference thing. Next, let's talk about Steve Trevor. Steve Trevor, who in literally any other story would have been the hero, is a damsel in distress. Wonder Woman is constantly saving him from danger, but what makes Steve a great character is that he spends every issue of Wonder Woman being saved while still being a badass in his own right. This is a balance that writers have been trying to bring to damsels for forever, and while it's probably an easier one to strike when the character is in the army, Steve's writing is still top-notch. What I really like is that the story never attempts to emasculate or humiliate Steve for needing Wonder Woman's rescue, or that of the Holiday College girls. He respects them and their commitment to the war effort wholeheartedly, and when he gets saved, he says thank you and everyone fights Nazis together. Because of this, it feels like the most natural thing in the world, and in fact, Steve gets frequently frustrated with getting credit for Wonder Woman's victories. This dynamic is incredibly important. The typical savior and damsel roles are reversed, but it's not done in a jokey or ironic way. Both Diana and Steve have depth, agency, and strength, and the story presents this as entirely organic. I genuinely believe that Marston was far ahead of his time here. Steve's character gives him a reason to be an active force in the story, even if he finds himself on the wrong side of danger with alarming regularity. Much like Diana herself, Steve Trevor went right off track after Marston wasn't writing him anymore. There was an early story where he used Wonder Woman's lasso to force her to marry him, and there are a lot of stories in that kind of vein, so yeah. Steve and the Amazons are great and form the backbone of Wonder Woman's supporting cast, but the real standouts to me, the real stars, and in my opinion the greatest part of Marston's story itself, are Etta Candy and the Holiday College girls. Diana meets Etta Candy off screen between Sensation Comics 1 and 2. She's a young girl who came to the hospital Diana worked at to get her appendix out, and afterwards decided to go on a candy binge, which I know sounds unimportant, but we'll come back around to that in a sec. Let's set the stage. Diana and Steve have been captured by the nefarious Dr. Poison, who by the way is legitimately terrifying. She's going to administer a truth serum to Steve so he'll spill some army secrets, and while Diana is able to switch out the syringes, it's going to buy him some time at best. Diana escapes to get reinforcements while Dr. Poison spikes the army's water supply with Reverso, which makes the soldiers do the opposite of what they're told. They're not going to be of any use, and Steve is being held at gunpoint, so Diana needs a different approach to save him. She goes to visit Etta Candy at Holiday College, where she's leading the marching band. Diana tells her she needs the band and 100 more girls to march into a Nazi base to save Steve. Immediately, girls from all over the college volunteer, and Wonder Woman leads them to the base, where they all distract the gun-toting men until they can handcuff them, while Wonder Woman saves Steve and she and Etta fight Dr. Poison. I feel like I can't play up the power of this story enough. The Holiday College girls volunteer with no reservations to march into a Nazi base. There's no hint of fear, no trepidation, just girls doing their part for the war effort. The energy of these scenes is incredible. These panels are, I would argue, some of the most important in Wonder Woman's history, because this is Marston showing us what he wants from Wonder Woman as a character. The Holiday College girls are his thesis. This is the effect he wants to have on the young girls and young boys of this country, inspiring them to be fearless, to rise to challenges that have traditionally seemed to be on them. Reading Sensation Comics 2 is when I really felt like I understood the scope of what Marston was trying to accomplish. Wonder Woman herself was an unprecedented character, but here we have girls with nothing but gumption and a rad drumline being heroes too. This effect, by the way, is not limited to girls, as there's some great sequences of male male soldiers rallying around Wonder Woman and riding into battle too. But something about the Holiday Girls is just so moving, and I think that the idea that they're the ones that Wonder Woman always reaches out to when she needs help is incredibly powerful. I also think that it's good in that it gives Wonder Woman a sisterhood in man's world to ground her and make her feel at home. While some runs feature the Amazons more frequently than others, I think Diana would naturally seek out something like this to give her some familiarity in a world that otherwise couldn't be more foreign. Her friendship with Etta is wonderful and gives some light to the stories even when they're dark. Speaking of Etta Candy, she is basically my idol. When they introduced Etta as having recently gained a lot of weight, I assumed she would be the butt of a bunch of fat jokes, but to my surprise, Etta is not only comfortable with her body, but delights in it in a way I can't think of many characters doing before the last couple of decades. In fact, if you try to make Etta feel bad about her weight, she's going to straight up headbutt you. It was just kind of surprising to see body positivity in a comic from the 40s, but aside from that, Etta is just an absolute delight. She's a total firecracker, her gung-ho attitude and sass just lighting up the page, not to mention the fact that she throws down without hesitation. She consistently gets a laugh out of me, and one of my favorite stories is just about her beating up a bunch of thugs by accident while trying to find a dentist's office. Discovering Etta made me miss her dearly in any Wonder Woman stories where she's not present, and though there have been some great revivals or reboots of the character, nothing quite lives up to the original. The Amazons, Steve Trevor, Etta, and the Holiday College Girls form the main supporting cast for Wonder Woman, though there are some others, such as Diana's rival secretary who gets blown up and the only reaction anyone has is Diana basically telling her off. Just a personal favorite. Of course, every hero needs villains, and though Wonder Woman doesn't have quite the rogues gallery some other heroes do, there are some great standouts that have lasted her entire history. We'll talk about them next time, and we're going to come back to this little idea, so get ready for some spicy rants too. But that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, you can hit the like button to let me know, tell me your thoughts in the comment section below, subscribe to see when new videos come out, and I will see you soon.